Our second lesson today consists of two passages from the Old Testament. The first comes from the book of Deuteronomy. And in this text, Moses is giving the law to the people prior to their crossing the Jordan and entering the Promised Land. And in doing so, Moses anticipates that the day will come when the people will want to put a king over themselves to rule. And so he offers these instructions that those kings ought to follow when that day comes. Listen now for the word of God. When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One of your own community you may set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you who is not of your own community. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also, silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. The second reading from the Old Testament surveys King Solomon's career. We might listen to this text in light of these instructions we have heard from Deuteronomy and see how Solomon did as a king. Listen now to 1 Kings chapter 10, beginning with verse 14. The weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides that which came from all the traders from the businesses of the merchants, and from all the kings of Arabia and the governors of the land. King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each large shield. He made 300 shields of beaten gold. 3 minas of gold went into each of those shields. And the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. The king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest gold. The throne had 6 steps. The top of the throne was rounded in the back, and on each side of the seat were armrests with 2 lions standing beside the armrests, while 12 lions were standing, one on each end of a step on the 6 steps. Nothing like it was ever made in any kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. Silver was not considered anything in the days of Solomon. For the king had a fleet of ships of Tarshish at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the fleet of ships of Tarshish would come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Thus, King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. The whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought a present, objects of silver and gold, garments, weaponry, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. Solomon gathered chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedars as numerous as the sycamores of the Shephelah. Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kew, and the king's traders received them from Kew at a price. A chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. So through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Aram. King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidionite, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the Israelites, You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for you will surely incline your heart to follow their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. Among his wives were 700 princesses and 300 concubines, and his heart was turned away. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
King Solomon reigned over Israel during its period of greatest prosperity. He inherited a vast kingdom from his father David, and his aggressive economic activities and ambitious building projects only added to his wealth and prestige. He formed vast military alliances with neighboring countries and imported enormous amounts of precious stones, wood, and spices, even peacocks, as we heard in the text. Solomon seemed to have it all going for him. But a careful reading of his resume reveals that his love of money and fame and power ultimately eroded his faithfulness to God's commands. And the mistakes he made would mark the beginning of the end of Israel's freedom and independence. After Solomon, the nation would split into two, north and south, and both would be conquered by foreign powers in due time. The world today is full of stories of people who get too big for their britches, who get too wealthy and too powerful too quickly. Consider the sad stories of Disney Channel stars who make it big as kids, but then as adults their lives end up a mess. Or professional athletes who make horrible personal and financial decisions right in the prime of their careers. There are even a number of megachurch pastors who gain this large following and become celebrity pastors only to end up mired in scandal. Why does this happen? Well, money and fame and power are not bad per se, not bad in and of themselves, but the unmistakable truth is that they seem to be the things that human beings idolize the most. And as such, they can be dangerous. What might be a blessing in one moment could wind up being a curse in the next if we are not careful. And sadly, Solomon was not careful, despite the wisdom that God had given him. Because as we heard in Deuteronomy, Moses had warned the Israelites that their kings must not import lots of horses, or marry lots of wives, or acquire lots of gold. Otherwise, the text says, his heart will turn away. And yet Solomon ends up being guilty of doing all of these things, one by one, in an almost systematic way. He imports horses from Egypt and Q. He marries many wives, 700 to be exact, never mind the 300 concubines, and he acquires so much gold that it takes 8 verses in Kings to describe all of the things he made with gold, chariots and thrones and drinking vessels. Solomon's kingdom is a dramatic transformation from Israel's humble beginnings. Remember, the people had begun as slaves in the land of Egypt, servants of Pharaoh and laborers for Pharaoh's massive building campaigns. If any of you have ever been to Egypt or even just seen pictures of the pyramids, you know how much the pharaohs loved to build stuff, right? But through Moses, God had set the people free and led them through the desert, sheltering the vulnerable nation with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And then Moses gave the people the law, the gist of which was that the people were not to repeat among themselves the conditions from which they had been freed in Egypt. They were not to duplicate Egyptian life in the promised land. And yet by the time we get to Solomon, Israel has done exactly that. Solomon has enslaved people for his massive building projects. He's married Pharaoh's daughter as his favorite wife. She got her own palace. And he's imported Egyptian horses. The scripture's verdict on Solomon is clear, especially to readers who have read Deuteronomy. Solomon has become Pharaoh. Solomon has become Pharaoh, and so the nation has taken a 180-degree turn from slavery in Egypt. The freedom that God granted them only led them to sin. And Moses' warning to Israel's kings came to pass. Solomon's heart turned away, and Solomon became Pharaoh. Now, if we zoom out on this story and look at Solomon's life from 38,000 feet, a lesson emerges that might be somewhat surprising. And that is that God's blessings do not necessarily bring us closer to God. God's blessings do not by default bring us closer to God, because in fact, sometimes God's blessings end up being temptations. As we receive blessings from God, the question we have to ask ourselves is, are these blessings leading us to a deeper obedience to God's commands? Or are these blessings leading us to believe that we are the masters of our own fate and the captains of our souls, that we are self-sufficient at last? A number of years ago, I had a conversation with a Guatemalan pastor about what we refer to in the United States as the prosperity gospel. Maybe you've heard that term before. The prosperity gospel is essentially a flavor of Christianity that emphasizes material prosperity as a reward for following God. The movement is big here in the United States, and it's especially big in much of the developing world. The pastor had just shared with our group a series of stories of people who had wandered into his church, mired in drug addictions and on the verge of losing their families, but they had converted to Christianity, and now their life was back on track, and as they followed God, they were becoming healthier and wealthier. So after his talk, I pressed him a little bit on some of his claims. Isn't it wrong, I asked him, to use God as a means to an end, to use faith as a means to wealth? Don't extravagant promises of health and wealth only encourage love of money rather than love of God? Isn't discipleship costly rather than lucrative? Well, in classic pastoral style, he answered my questions with questions. And he said, "And how are things going with the church in America? You already have wealth and good medicine and good security, so you don't even need to pray for it. Your church is shrinking because you don't depend on God anymore. You've got it all already." Now, I still think I had some valid questions in there somewhere, but I did learn valuable lessons that day, one of which is that it's easy to be critical of the prosperity gospel when you yourself are already prosperous. It's easy not to pray for daily bread when you have a month's worth of food in your own pantry. It's easy for God to seem irrelevant or unnecessary when you can meet most of your own needs by yourself. As slaves in Egypt and as a wandering desert caravan, the Israelites depended on God for daily bread coming down as manna from heaven and for daily water gushing forth from the rock. They learned to depend on God to lead them as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. But when they reached the promised land, a prosperous land flowing with milk and honey, they gradually built up their wealth and power and influence. They conquered and subdued the nations around them. And ultimately, their kings stopped depending on God because they believed they could simply depend upon themselves. They didn't stop believing in God. God simply became irrelevant. I suppose it would be too bold to draw a strict parallel between the life of Solomon and the decline of religiosity in the Western world, but I don't think they're altogether unrelated. Sometimes we think that atheism is sweeping across the land, but that's actually really not the case. A Pew Research survey conducted just over a year ago revealed that 80% of U.S. Americans answered yes to the question, "Do you believe in God?" And 56% said that they believed in the God as described in the Bible. And yet only about 36% of Americans attend religious services regularly. In other words, there are a lot of people out there who believe in God in general, or even the Christian God in particular, but who do not go to church. So maybe it's not that people have stopped believing in God, but rather that God just seems irrelevant or even unnecessary to many of them as they make their way through their day-to-day lives. And if that's the case, then it's worth asking ourselves if some of the things that we value most as a culture might not necessarily be edifying to our lives of faith. Consider as a prime example the way in which we elevate the virtues of independence and self-sufficiency. We value the ability to make our own decisions, right? The idea that we can determine our own fate with enough grit. We love the freedom to say what we want and assemble when we want and own the property that we want and so on. And to be sure, these political freedoms are certainly blessings. I can't imagine what life would be like without something that we take as for granted as free speech. A few years ago, I traveled to a country where I was warned that if my money started blowing away and I were chasing after it, I shouldn't stop it with my foot because it was illegal to step on the image of the king, which was printed on those bills, and if I were caught, I could be thrown in prison. So to be sure, our political freedoms are truly blessings. But every blessing has its shadow side, and I think that the same might be said of some of the cultural values we hold most dear. Because as we pursue individual power and affluence, there is always the danger that in doing so, we might abandon our awareness of our need for God. And as we lose track of our need for God, we will be less likely to obey God's will. In short, as we prosper, there's a danger that we might forget God. We may not stop believing in God, but we may simply decide that we can get along just fine without God, and so God just becomes a sort of afterthought in our day-to-day lives. In a culture of affluence, indifference, not atheism, is the biggest threat to our faith. I think Solomon fell prey to indifference. It's not that he decided that God didn't exist anymore. After all, he was the one who built God's temple in Jerusalem. It's just that Solomon decided that his own power and fame and wealth mattered more to him than obedience to God's commands, as Moses had outlined. And so the Bible reports that Solomon spent twice as long building his own house as he spent building the temple. Solomon's building priorities reveal what was going on inside of him. He himself and all the power and wealth and fame that came with being king was more important to him than submitting to God's commands. When I was in seminary in Pittsburgh, I did a lot of pulpit supply at small rural churches, which was a lot of fun. And one day after a service, I was speaking with a man who was responding to a sermon I had preached on praying with a sense of urgency. And the man didn't understand why he ought to pray very much, at least as much as I had suggested. He said, "I just don't see the point of prayer. What do I need to pray about?" I asked him if he had any worries or concerns in his life. "I'm not a worrier," he said proudly. Wouldn't we all love to be able to say that? "I'm not a worrier." "Do you have any needs at all?" I said. "Any dreams for your future?" And the man said, I have pretty much everything I need. I have a good career. Everything's planned out well. I can do pretty much whatever I want." And so he thought there was really no need to pray. think this man's take on his life is pretty much how we tend to think about freedom, at least the freedom that comes with prosperity. The man was wealthy enough that he could meet all of his own physical needs. He was confident in his abilities, and he was privileged and powerful enough in his culture that he really could do pretty much whatever he wanted. But the problem is that biblical freedom isn't about doing whatever we want. Biblical freedom is something that God provides in order that we might conform to the image of Christ and submit to the will of God. Biblical freedom is about exchanging the death-dealing slavery to sin for the life-giving service of discipleship. It seems counterintuitive, I know, but biblical freedom has as its end an altogether different kind of conformity. Conformity not to sin and to self, but to discipleship and to Christ. So true freedom is found in obedience to Christ our Lord. And so Paul can say, as he does in Galatians, that Christ has set us free not for self-indulgence, not for doing whatever we want, but rather so that through love we might become servants to one another. Because we are not led by the flesh, but we are led by God's Spirit. As Solomon received blessings from God, blessings of wealth and power and influence, he didn't use the freedom that came with them to pursue more faithfulness to God's law as Moses had outlined it. Instead, his heart turned away, and he became a servant to the self-indulgence of the flesh, to use Paul's favorite metaphor. It didn't need to be this way. Solomon could have used his freedom and these blessings to pursue God's will more carefully, but with all his needs met, Solomon became indifferent to God. Freed from physical needs, he figured that he had been freed from spiritual needs as well. God had blessed him greatly, but he responded to God's blessings with greed rather than gratitude. And friends, that is the lesson today. That's the point. Blessings can be temptations if we receive them with greed rather than gratitude. Blessings can be temptations if we receive them with greed rather than with gratitude, because if we receive them with greed, we'll be prone to use them for self-indulgence, thinking God has given them to us so that we can do whatever we want, and our hearts may turn away, thinking that we don't really need God anymore. But if we receive God's blessings with gratitude, the Spirit will stir in us a deeper desire to conform all the more carefully to God's call on our lives. And we'll come to know that Christ has set us free in order that we might love and be subject to one another as he has commanded us. Someone asked, what if you woke up tomorrow with only the things you had thanked God for today? What if you woke up tomorrow with only the things you had thanked God for today? What would you wake up with? Does gratitude saturate your heart when you survey all that God has done for you? So friends, may our hearts not be led astray by God's rich blessings, but rather may we respond to God's blessings with an even greater discipleship to Jesus Christ. After all, as Solomon should have known, faithful discipleship is what makes a person truly wise. Thanks be to God. Amen.